The Battle of Little Bighorn became one of the most well-known defeats in American history and attracted its share of legends. At first, it was a tragedy, where Custer and his men were portrayed as brave heroes who died fighting Indian savages. Over time, opinions changed, and Custer came to be seen as a glory-hungry fool on a mission of indigenous genocide. There's a lot of different beliefs about this famous battle, and many of them are wrong. Was it all Custer's fault? Did he really have a last stand? And who was truly to blame for America's defeat? These are the biggest misconceptions about the battle and how they've been debunked over the course of 150 years. No matter how many men lived or died under Custer, a lot of people will safely assume that they were all white Americans. To a lot of people, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was a perfect example of white American aggression being resisted by Native Americans just trying to protect their land. The Lakota chief Sitting Bull and his followers were protesting American expansion and unfair treaties that were stealing their land. Custer and the white Americans were trying to crush them, only to get themselves killed in the process. There's a lot of truth to this, but it's not entirely accurate. The first thing is that it wasn't a simple case of white Americans versus Native Americans. Not every Native American, even among his own Lakota, agreed with Sitting Bull. At the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull gathered about 10,000 people to his cause. It was a huge number for the Plains Indians, but it was only a minority of the groups involved. Most Lakota, Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho didn't join him. In fact, several native groups like the Arikara and the Crow opposed Sitting Bull and allied with the Americans. 33 Native American scouts worked with Custer's 7th Cavalry, and several were killed alongside him. Sitting Bull's followers weren't pacifists and were happy to attack any native groups who allied with their enemy, which turned groups like the Crow and Arikara against them. For example, one of Custer's long-term friends was an Arikara scout named Bloody Knife, who was committed to hunting down Sitting Bull after his followers raided his village and killed his family. The Crow were especially strong opponents of Sitting Bull for another reason. Little Bighorn was their land. Sitting Bull and his followers were indeed fighting on native land when they killed Custer. The land just wasn't theirs. As far as the Crow were concerned, Sitting Bull was the invader, not Custer. It is common for people to oversimplify the history of the American West as one of whites versus natives, when the reality was a complex mix of alliances and rivalries, where native fought native, and sometimes did so side by side with white American troops. So the simple story of Americans versus natives isn't quite true. But what about Custer himself? Was he a fool or was he a brave hero? As always in history, it's a bit of both. Firstly, the idea that Custer charged blindly into battle and got all his men killed is a myth. Most of Custer's 7th Cavalry survived the battle. In total, Custer brought 650 officers, soldiers, and scouts with him to the Little Bighorn. 268 of these men would die. A staggering number, but one that still left most men alive. What Custer actually did was get the portion of those troops under his command killed. Custer's men were organized into 12 companies of about 50 men each, with some other scouts and civilians along for the ride. 5 of those companies went with Custer and were almost entirely wiped out alongside him, aside from a few messengers and scouts who Custer sent away before his final charge. But the remaining 7 companies mostly survived. One company was escorting the supply train, while the remaining 6 were split between Custer's subordinate officers, Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen. These other companies suffered some casualties, but almost 400 of them would survive, including Benteen and Reno. Rather than a blind charge, Custer's attack was part of a well-thought-out strategy. Reno was to attack from the south and Custer from the north, while Benteen would flank to the west and cut off Sitting Bull's escape. When Custer left Benteen and Reno for the first time, he did so with a solid plan in place for the battle to come. The plan evolved as Custer gained new information. Upon realizing that the camp was larger than expected, Custer reassessed and sent word back to Captain Benteen requesting more supplies and reinforcements. These orders were famously ignored by Benteen, leaving Custer to launch his attack with fewer men than he liked, before the element of surprise passed him by. Perhaps Custer was still a fool for pressing the attack without these reinforcements, but clearly he didn't just rush in wildly without thinking. U.S. military doctrine held that the Native Americans weren't a threat unless they massively outnumbered the American soldiers. This had been proven on the battlefield many times, even by Custer himself. With over 200 men at his back, and another 450 attacking from other angles, American military doctrine would have expected Custer to win. In hindsight, we know he lost, but from the perspective of a man with the information that Custer had, based on his own scouting and his experience fighting Native Americans, Custer's fatal attack wasn't as reckless or stupid as it's sometimes portrayed. So, what did the attack look like? Since all of Custer's attacking men died, we have to rely on native accounts and archaeology to piece it together. We know that Custer tried to force a crossing of the Little Bighorn River into the camp, but was fought off by native warriors. Here, the stories start to diverge massively. Some native accounts reported that an officer wearing a buckskin coat and a large hat was shot off his horse almost immediately, causing the Americans to panic and flee, taking the officer's body with them. This description matches Custer's known outfit and his tendency to lead his men from the front, but multiple officers would have worn similar outfits. The fact that Custer's body was found a mile away from the river atop Custer's Hill, with evidence that he'd fought in his last moments with 2 equally fatal wounds in his head and chest, it's unlikely he was killed down in the river crossing. Custer quickly realized that the resistance was too strong. Another sign he wasn't as reckless as people portray him, and began to retreat back up the hills on the far side of the river. But the Native Americans pursued him. The Americans suffered heavy casualties in the river attack, and suffered many more as they retreated to more defensible positions. Custer made his last stand atop the appropriately named Custer Hill, or sometimes Last Stand Hill, but there were actually 2 stands. About half of the survivors of the river attack made their final stand on an adjacent hill, now known as Calhoun Hill, named for Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, who commanded it. Calhoun's men held out for a short time before the enemy completely encircled and cut them down. At most, about 40 men were still alive when Custer made his actual final stand atop Custer Hill. Was Custer the last of these men to fall, as so many movies and paintings show? We don't really know. Sitting Bull would later tell a newspaper that his warriors told him Custer was the last one alive. The long hair stood like a sheaf of corn with all the ears fallen around him. But there are plenty of other versions of what happened. The Cheyenne warrior Yellow Nose claimed that he took down the last man atop Custer Hill with a brutal blow to the head. A body matching Yellow Nose's story was found atop the hill and determined to be General Custer's brother, Tom. Several other native warriors claimed that the last American alive was an officer mounted on his horse, who, upon realizing that he was the last man alive, raised his pistol to his head and denied the enemy the glory of the final kill. A lone officer with what may have been a self-inflicted gunshot wound was found a little away from the rest of the bodies on Custer Hill, and was determined to be a lieutenant named Henry Harrington. It seems that Custer truly did make a final stand with the last few dozen men atop the hill that now bears his name, but we will never know who exactly was the last man standing. So the details of how Custer met his end are murky, but they leave an obvious question. Where were the rest of his men? You'll remember that 3 companies under Major Reno were supposed to be attacking the camp at the same time as Custer, while Captain Benteen had been sent orders to send reinforcements before Custer even began his attack. Both of these plans collapsed. Those who don't blame Custer for his defeat often blame Reno and Benteen instead for failing to do their jobs. The story goes that had Reno and Benteen done as they were told, Custer and his men would have lived. Custer's widow, Libby, was the strongest voice for blaming them after her husband's death. She even went as far as to block a monument to Reno on the battlefield after his death some years later, saying that the army should not single out for honor the one coward of the regiment. The truth about what happened is more complicated than that. Let's start with Reno. He was supposed to lead an attack on the southern end of the camp to split Sitting Bull's attention while Custer attacked from the north. Reno actually did this. His men were the first to engage the enemy on that day. However, just like Custer, he underestimated his enemy and called a retreat after less than an hour. Does this make him a coward? Or was he, as some witnesses later claimed, simply drunk? Eyewitness accounts do suggest that Reno was drinking on the day. Private William Taylor remembered seeing Reno and his fellow officers passing around a bottle of amber-colored liquid in the lead-up to the battle, and Reno's orders were shouted with a drunken slur. Several other witnesses backed up the story, and Reno would eventually be court-martialed and discharged from the army in 1880 for getting into a fistfight while drunk. However, it was normal for soldiers to go into battle a little drunk in the 19th century. Native survivors of the battle noted that most of the American soldiers seemed to have whiskey in their flasks, not water. A little bit of liquid courage before a fight was just accepted. The real question is whether Reno being drunk led to the defeat in any way. The simple answer is probably not. The reality was that Reno's attack met overwhelming resistance. The 140 men at his disposal simply weren't enough to overcome the thousands of warriors who charged to meet them. The Native Americans had rifles too, and were good at using them. And Reno's men paid the price. By the time Reno sounded the retreat, at least 1/3 of his men were already dead or wounded. If Reno failed at anything, it wasn't calling off the attack too early and abandoning Custer. It was calling it off too late and leaving too many men to die for what was obviously a losing fight. Even worse, in many versions of the tale, was Captain Benteen. Benteen abandoned his planned attack and then blatantly ignored Custer's orders for reinforcements. If any man is to blame, surely it would be him, wouldn't it? Going deeper into events gives Benteen some support. First, the collapse of Reno's attack would have left Benteen's flank completely exposed. Had he pressed on as planned, his men would have easily been surrounded and killed after Reno's had been finished off. Instead, Benteen called off the original attack plan and linked up with Reno's surviving forces atop a defensible hill. It was a strategically sound move. But then there were Custer's orders. We know Benteen received them and never followed them. Later, Benteen claimed that he always thought Custer was still alive, charging off somewhere to seek glory and leaving his men behind, as he was known to do. Benteen instead focused on his situation. The Native Americans who had repelled Reno were surely going to attack the rest of them soon, so Benteen and Reno both decided that they couldn't risk sending any of their men off onto an unknown situation to help Custer, when their situation was already a mess. Benteen and Reno were correct in their predictions. The Native Americans were soon upon them and kept all 6 companies under constant siege for the next 2 days. Benteen, Reno, and their men fought bravely through the night of the 25th, all day on the 26th, and only stopped on the 27th. Benteen and Reno could not be accused of cowardice, as they led their men in their defense with almost no sleep for the next 48 hours. It is telling that despite all the outsiders accusing Benteen of cowardice, his own men never said such a thing. Wherever Benteen went, the soldiers' faces lighted up with hope, one of them recalled. Benteen's leadership through the rest of the battle earned him the nickname of the Savior of the Seventh from his men, even if that nickname didn't become popular with the public. If Benteen had followed his orders, there is no reason to believe his outnumbered men wouldn't have met the same fate as Custer's. It's possible that Benteen's men might have made the difference and saved Custer's, assuming they could have even gotten there while Custer was still alive. But it's also possible that they would have only succeeded in getting themselves killed. Reno's weakened men couldn't have held the hill alone and would certainly have died too. A court of inquiry called in 1879 could find no fault with Reno or Benteen for their actions in the battle. Ultimately, Benteen and Reno weren't the reason that 268 Americans died on that day, but they are probably the reason that number wasn't much higher. But these questions of Custer's mistakes, Benteen's treachery, or Reno's drunkenness are just expressions of the biggest mistake of all that people ask about the Little Bighorn, that the outcome of the battle must be explained by the failures of Custer and the Americans, and not by the success of Sitting Bull and his followers. The Battle of the Little Bighorn shocked the United States because they didn't believe it should have been possible. How could the greatest, most powerful, most advanced nation on Earth be defeated in battle by people they dismissed as savages? It had to be something the Americans did wrong, because everyone knew the Indians couldn't win by themselves. In reality, Sitting Bull and his followers deserve due credit for the victory at Little Bighorn. We know that Sitting Bull's men were excellent in battle. Barely a week earlier, on June 18th, about 1,500 of Sitting Bull's men under the Lakota warrior Crazy Horse had won a victory over a similarly sized American force at the Battle of the Rosebud River. The American commander, General Crook, was stunned at how the enemy ran rings around his men. Remember, American military doctrine at the time believed that Native Americans were only a threat if they massively outnumbered the Americans. Sitting Bull's men had proven this was wrong just days before defeating Custer. News of this battle never reached Custer. The Lakota and Cheyenne were excellent warriors who knew how to use modern military equipment. This was not the 16th century where natives had never seen guns and horses before. Guns and horses had been part of Plains Indian life for generations. Native American boys were taught to shoot and ride before white American boys would even finish school. The native warriors at the Little Bighorn were more than capable of matching American soldiers, even before we consider the imbalance of numbers. Then there was motivation. Sitting Bull's people were fighting for their way of life. The U.S. government had sworn to wipe them out and take their land, bringing centuries of free-roaming Plains life to an end. Custer's men were fighting a campaign. Sitting Bulls were fighting for the end of their entire world. Time proved them right. The U.S. responded to the defeat with more troops that strangled Sitting Bull's movement and forced him to surrender in 1881. Little Bighorn was their greatest victory, but also their last. Although it didn't save them in the long run, the commitment and skill of thousands of trained warriors determined the outcome of the Battle of the Little Bighorn more than the hubris or mistakes of their opponents. However, the uncertainty over exactly what happened in Custer's final hours, and the powerful emotions attached to the battle, means that people will continue to spread myths and mistakes about this critical moment in history. The same questions that came up in the days after the battle are the same ones we ask today. Was Custer a hero or a fool? Did he get himself killed, or was he let down by his officers? Should we see this as Custer's defeat, or Sitting Bull's victory? We can give the best answers we can, but we'd be foolish to think that'll stop people asking them.